God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We begin by singing the hymn Amazing Grace, which you can find as hymn number 375. welcome to our 3 hours at the cross. Many of you will know how this works, this pattern, that basically we'll have a hymn, a reading from the Bible, a reflection, poems and silence, each half an hour. Please feel free to come and go as you wish, as is helpful for you. If you want in the silence to move to a different space, please feel free to do that as well. The poems that I read are on your little booklet if you need time to look at them further. They're in the order that I will be using them. But we're going to begin now with a reading of part of the story.
Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance.
Lord, may we hear you speaking with us and meet with you in these hours. Amen. Every journey that I've made from the big city of Gloucester to Minchinhampton, whichever route I've taken in the last few days, there have been roadworks. There's simply no avoiding them. To get here, I've had to be stopped on my way at something that's being dug up, recreated, mended, repaired in the road. Simply no getting round it. And you know, there's no getting round it. We cannot get to Easter Day. We cannot journey to Easter Day without stopping, pausing at the cross. This great story of amazing grace, which is going to unfold with us now, with familiar words and familiar hymns, and we will watch and we will wait. Watching and waiting. two different ways of approaching this story. The great Alex Ferguson, who thought he would get in Good Friday, the one who led Manchester United for so long, he writes not about religion and faith, but about leadership. And he says we need two kinds of watching. We need to watch, as we are going to do, for detail, for the little things in the story, the little things that God is speaking to us about. And we also watch in this time for the big picture to emerge, the meaning of all that happens. And yes, to some extent, this time carries with it one of those health warnings, because the truth is there is content here that may disturb us. There is no getting away from it, and some may find this uncomfortable, but actually we're going to talk about death and disaster. Actually, death and disaster is often about little things and meaning. At the heart of any event, there is a person. There are partners, there are children, there are siblings, parents, grandparents, friends, colleagues, neighbours, and so it goes on. Communities and nations sometimes that are affected by events, and in particular are affected by a death. We're going to pause and watch as Jesus dies. We're going to see how many lives he touches, and we're going to think about the detail and the meaning. The very strange thing when we come to talk about death is that although for all of us it is the one sure and certain thing in life, researchers will tell us that fewer than 10% of us have actually ever thought or talked with anyone else about our own death. We actually would prefer to avoid it if we can. And avoidance of what is happening is right where we begin in our story. We begin in the garden. The table has been cleared, the party is over, and they're in the shadows. And actually none of those present want to face the reality. They haven't wanted to face it, the disciples, for 3 years of what's going to happen. And even Jesus, as we heard, Jesus, fully human, cries out in anguish at the moment, struggles and pleads with God to let this thing pass from him. But he struggles in prayer, watches and waits, making that struggle alone. There's a great novel that I enjoyed from a few years ago. I can't really recommend it because it's got such a lot of swearing in it. It's called Staying Alive by Matt Bowman. And it's the story of a young man who was 31, and he discovers he has cancer and only 4 months to live. And he simply cannot bring himself to talk about it. He avoids the topic outwardly, yet alone, he battles with fear and, well, more and more fear. And just as Jesus does in the garden, it's alone that he faces the things that will show love to the world. In the novel, the young man appears to be completely friendless. He has a lot of acquaintances, but he seems to have no friends, not one person that he can think of to whom he can share those really deep thoughts and feelings. Jesus, of course, we know the story. Jesus has friends. Jesus has men and women who have been with him for 3 long years, facing hard questions, been through all the tough times. They've laughed and they've eaten and drunk together. But you know, Jesus' friends don't want to face death. They don't want to talk about it. And they do what most of us do. They simply avoid the reality by going to sleep. Now, we might not literally go to sleep, but all too often we turn away. We don't want to talk about it. We don't like to sit with the things that make us uncomfortable, even though we are people with that great hope that death is not the end. In the past few years, I've actually spent a lot of my time thinking about death. Not so much in a personal sense. My own life-changing bereavements happened a few years ago, and I am not, as such, living under a specific notice of impending end. But in the past few years, my work has focused a lot on trying to help us, the church, minister as well as we can to the millions, and I do mean millions of people we meet, because death touches life. The filmmaker Nora Ephron wrote, "Everybody dies. Death is a sniper. It strikes people you love, people you know. It's everywhere." And the disciples? They struggled. When the time came ever closer in the scene we've just heard, there was anger, that sudden breaking out of violence, as if that would hold back time. And that's also a common human reaction when we get bad news for ourselves, or even more so bad news for someone else. We fight. We demand justice. We suggest that things are unfair, unreasonable, that they can only be fixed and cured. And yes, just like in the story we heard, people get hurt in the fallout. And yet still, like the disciples, we'd rather avoid the issue altogether. In a different, hugely best-selling book, which I think now for several years has remained on the top 10 list, the book When Breath Becomes Air, the Christian, as it happened, brain surgeon Paul Kalanithi writes of living with the reality of impending death and how he moved forward in the face of it. And his answer turns out to be, you move forward with love and hope. Or as he put it, mercy trumps justice. And that determination has inspired millions, and in his death, people found courage. Jesus comes in the end to face death with calm acceptance. He finds comfort and strength, not in denial or avoidance, but in the presence of God and through the ministry of angels. Perhaps as we sit here at the cross, perhaps it's partly about accepting the truth and reality of our human condition. Perhaps it's a moment when we too will find courage to speak about things, to sit with the reality of our lives, to find the kind of courage that so many of us found when we think back to those 3 years ago during the pandemic, when talking about death moved from something done in dark corners to in the news headlines every single day. For the reality is, as for Jesus, even as we breathe our first breath, the inevitability of our last will be with us as well. So as I read the poem, My Grandmother and I Are Talking About Death, which actually was of course written in the pandemic by Nikita Gill, and then we'll go into some silence for a while. Think in that time of Jesus in the garden and reflect on life and death and be still at the foot of the cross. My grandmother and I are talking about death. Over the phone, her voice feels even further than the thousands of miles between us. We talk every Saturday, but time has lost its meaning during the plague. She says endings are sacred. I tell her they are painful. Her voice is steady. For endings to evolve us, they must be painful. She says death is faithful. It follows us from the moment we are born till we finally learn to welcome it. And she speaks like this: I feel like a maze of frozen streets, an aimless wandering, stricken even by the idea of a world without her in it. And here we are again, talking about death. I grip the phone and tell her she is the only holy I know. How she must promise me that no matter what, we will see each other again, that we will always see each other again. I picture her smile through the phone, lace tablecloth under careworn gentle fingers, the phone shaking against her ear. One day you must learn that the God you are seeking will always live in the act of letting go. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Lord, help us to know more of that great love this day, the love that is with us every breath that we take, the love that is with all of those whom we love, and with every part of the creation that you love. Amen. We stand and sing hymn number 10, Abide with Me.
Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." A little later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And about an hour later, yet another kept insisting, "Surely this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" They kept heaping many other insults on him. When the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you, then, the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so."
The scene changes. We've moved from the garden, but we're still watching for the detail, watching for the meaning. Now we are watching in the kind of place where the eye of a camera, a security camera, often watches, or a TV camera. We are watching in a courtyard and in a makeshift courtroom. I find courtyards quite fascinating. Courtyards are where we find the workers, the kind of people who are easily just ignored and overlooked, not the main part of the story, the kind of people who do the jobs that actually make things happen, sometimes working out of desperation, sometimes out of compulsion, and sometimes out of love. Courtyards are the kind of places where we meet servants and slaves and soldiers. I actually find it quite easy to recognise these people. As it happens, I come from generations of serving girls. Both my grandmothers were in service, not a million miles from here, in Tetbury, working in big houses, working in sewing rooms and laundries. And I like to think of them snatching a break, being out literally in a courtyard, a kind of place where people come and go and paths cross and conversations happen, the kind of conversations that might actually change lives. And I've noticed quite often in literature, in novels, films, it's often workers, these overlooked characters, who pay attention, who join the dots, who notice the connections, and yes, who ask the questions. Of course, it's part of real life as well. I was recently re-watching the film Made in Dagenham, which was made in 2010 about events from the 1970s, and I noticed that it's in the break times, when they step away from the work of making cars, that questions are asked. The questions that revealed that, it turns out, the men were being paid significantly more than the women. And it was in the break times, in the courtyard, if you like, that the plans were hatched, that began the cycle of change that still rolls on to this day. So watch in this courtyard that we've just heard about. Listen as the questions are being asked by very ordinary people. And at first glance, we think the servant girl isn't asking a question. She sort of appears to make a statement to these frightened men in the shadows. Now, I've always imagined Peter as a sort of physically quite a big chap, probably influenced by lots of paintings by people like Caravaggio and Rubens. But now, all Peter wants to do is disappear into the background as she makes her statement, which she, of course, might have made with that little intonation that we hear so much these days when the end of the sentence goes up and it becomes a question. You were with him? The implication is clear. Do you know him? And do you know what? Quite simply, I found myself wondering this. What would have happened if Peter had actually said, yes, I do know him actually, as it happens? What if he'd been willing to talk about Jesus, this man who was so charismatic that he'd been following him for 3 years? You see, just maybe this serving girl, this woman out in a courtyard, maybe she wanted to know more. Maybe she's not so very far removed from Zacchaeus up his tree, or the woman at the well, all those mums and children who wanted a blessing. After all, this man, Jesus, was a man being talked about everywhere and by everyone, and perhaps especially by those who cross paths in courtyards, servants who are so often ignored and overlooked. Questions being asked at the break time. What if? What if we know him? And that made me think about me being ready to give an answer, about me being so passionate about what I believe that when a question is asked, I long to say more. I was in a coffee shop this week. This is nothing unusual. But as it happened, I overheard a customer asking the barista to recommend a coffee. And I heard the barista reply in a way that suggested he cared so deeply about what he was doing. And he actually had some knowledge and he had some love as he told the person the answer. And I thought to myself, blimey, that's just coffee. What if I answered people who inquired about Jesus with that level of energy? This moment of Peter's denial reminds many of us of those moments when we have failed to recognise Jesus in our lives and failed to follow him. But in many ways, his denial is much more straightforward than that. It's about not being willing to answer a question. It's about being unable to give an answer that flows out of a passionate conviction that being a follower of Jesus is simply the best thing that has ever happened. He is the best person that I know. He has changed my life. And when we fail to answer and fail to listen to the yearning that may be there in the question, then who knows, the moment that leads to life and faith may go. But of course, as we continue to watch for the detail in that story, we realise that not all the questions being asked are benign. We move from the courtyard to the makeshift courtroom. And the courtyard also had the aggression and the anger, the hardened behaviour of soldiers who were full of bravado and confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from just obeying orders. And they put their questions to Jesus. And then the religious leaders, moving into their semblance of a court with Pilate, they all start to push these questions at Jesus as the circumstances of his death begin to touch their lives. And yes, the story is beginning to turn nasty. Jesus is the still point at the heart of the storm. And perhaps our eyes move away from the questions and the questionable activities, from the brutality to the man at the centre, who is still there, resolute in himself, even though he is already bruised and broken. And he answers in his unsettling way, provoking anger and later haunting people's dreams. The actions we take, the choices we make, the words we speak have consequences. And all of this that we're watching now, the marks thrown at Peter, the questions thrown at Jesus, they're all leading us on into one direction, the direction of the cross that we cannot avoid. Asking questions, being ready to give answers. I'm going to read a poem called The Mistake. And then in the next silence, you might think about mistakes. You might think about how you answer that question. Do you know Jesus? Did you know him? The mistake. With the mistake, your life goes in reverse. Now you can see exactly what you did wrong yesterday and wrong the day before, and each mistake leads back to something worse. And every nuance of your hypocrisy toward yourself and every excuse stands solidly on the perspective lines, and there is perfect visibility. What an enlightenment. The colonnade rolls past on either side. You needn't move. The statues of your errors brush your sleeve. You watch the tale turn back, and you are dismayed. And this dismay at this big mistake, is made worse by the sight of all those who knew all along where these mistakes would lead, those frozen friends who watched the crisis break. Why didn't they say? Oh, but they did indeed, said with a murmur when the time was wrong, or by a mild refusal to assent, or told you plainly, but you would not heed. Yes, you can hear them now. It hurts. It's worse than any sneer from any enemy. Take this dismay. Lay claim to this mistake. Look straight along the lines of this reverse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Lord, by your cross we are forgiven. Forgive us when we fail to answer questions, when we fail to bear witness to others, to the truth and life of your love shown in Jesus. Amen. So we sing the hymn, Breathe on Me, Breath of God, which is number 174.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?"
So we continue watching for the detail, watching for meaning, watching again as the scene changes and gets more intense, watching on the road to the cross. Over the past, 15 or 20 years, I've taken to doing something, you might think it's odd, on Good Friday. After the preaching, after the processions, I've taken to going off into the city somewhere, Used to be Reading, more recent times it's just in Gloucester. And sitting anonymously among the shoppers, watching the crowds go by and thinking about indifference. And I might start thinking, of course, about the indifference there appears to be in our world now, the sheer ignorance of the story of Jesus on the cross, the midst of the bunnies and the chicks and the eggs and the lambs and all that stuff that's going on. As I sit there, you also find myself recalling the indifference that the world had then as well, as the drama of Jesus unfolded right in front of them. And sometimes I ask myself, do we even turn if something happens in front of us? Would a person stumbling and bleeding in the street stop me in my tracks? Or would it cause people to do anything at all? Would it cause people to gather and to point, to laugh or to help? Sometimes I think it would make us do that. There's always that funny sort of strange kind of tug that makes us go a little bit slower past the traffic accident, or maybe we notice the sight of some flowers where an accident has happened, or we still have that old thing of turning when we see the blue lights or hear the Nina go by. And although perhaps we aren't so keen on graphic detail, I do wonder if we're so very far removed from our ancestors who gathered, both in Tyburn and in Gloucester 400 years ago to watch a public execution. But we like to think it was different back then. Maybe we're more civilised than people in those days. Maybe back then, 2,000 years ago, maybe people were more interested in what was going on in the street. Maybe on that day they were paying attention. Luke tells us that Simon was coming in from the country. I sort of like to imagine him as someone from, Amberley or Minch coming into Gloucester, journeying in on the bank holiday weekend, visiting the family, doing a bit of last-minute shopping before the Shabbat begins. And then, there he is, minding his own business, and suddenly his life and the life of his family is changed forever. They are leading Jesus away, perhaps crossing from that makeshift court or that jostling courtyard, just crossing over through the street. And Simon, there he is, minding his own business, and he's grabbed from the crowd, and he's changed in that moment from being a watcher to being a participant. Now, we often tell stories like that, of moments when people become, we may even call them heroes, when they step in to help someone that they see in front of them. You may even have benefited yourself from such a person, the passing stranger who sees you at a moment when you've embarrassingly fallen in the street and someone rushes to pick you up and you go, "Oh, I'm all right, thank you." Or maybe you weren't all right. Perhaps it was more dramatic. There are many stories in our culture. We might think of something a few years ago, March 2017, when the MP Tobias Ellwood, I heard him in a podcast recently, talking about that day outside Parliament. You remember the terrorist attack? And he was the MP who rushed in to try and save PC Paul Palmer as he lay dying. And Tobias Ellwood talks very movingly about how he shared the story of that day with his young son. And both of them were drawn into that horror and violence. And yet both of them were clinging to a hope that in the end, good will prevail. You might know the story going further back of the passerby who, when Stephen Lawrence lay dying in the street, a passerby cradled his head and said, "Know that you are loved. Know that you are loved." In that moment, going from being a bystander to a participant. But of course, Mr. Ellwood, countless others, made a choice to get involved, as so many do every single day, as they step up to help someone who is carrying a cross that becomes just too much to bear. The thing about Simon of Cyrene is he wasn't given a choice that day. But still, his day and his future have been changed forever. He stands with all those who bear the cross of others who find sometimes they can't carry on. But if Simon has been named and is no longer just a watcher, we are told there are many, many more unnamed people lining those streets, looking on to what is happening. And we know that for 3 years, Jesus has attracted crowds, some who are listening, some who are heckling, some who just watch. And perhaps those people watching him now will include people whose lives have been changed by him, who he healed and transformed. And very particularly always in Luke's Gospel, women are mentioned. And there were women on the street, and they're weeping. And they're weeping because they identify so deeply with the grief that any parent feels at the untimely suffering and death of a child. Just last week, as it happens, I watched a documentary where the actor Jason Watkins and his wife Clara talked openly and movingly of the death of their 2-year-old daughter Maud. And last week I read an article by the psychiatrist Linda Blair about the loss of her 40-year-old daughter. The pain never goes away. So the women see Jesus and their hearts break. And Jesus, the man whose death is now touching so many lives, he turns and speaks to them. He doesn't say, "Thank you for your support." He doesn't say, "How can I help you? How can you help me?" He speaks to them of their needs. He speaks of the pain and grief of the world. And he hints at a future all too real where mothers and fathers and grandparents and children, all of us, will long to find that place of peace where we can bring up our families in security and love. And of course, this is the world we still live in. We've just had the knife angel in Gloucester, reminding us that this is a world where a young person might begin smoking a cigarette, sniffing a white powder, and then behaviour spirals out of control that leads to a fatal stabbing in streets not 5 minutes from where I live. We're still in a world where a careless, thoughtless driver can go out one day and career off a road and leave a family broken in pieces. We're still in a world where a gun is loaded, taken onto the streets of Liverpool, and in indifference, a child's life is ended. Weep for yourselves, says Jesus. Weep for yourselves, even as he struggles on the journey to the cross that will bear all the suffering and the pain of the world that he loves, the world that is and the world that is yet to come. I'll read the poem now called The Bodhi. And as we hear that poem, you might in this silence like to reach out and pray, listening to the cries of children, listening to the cries of those who grieve, listening to the pain of the world, and think about how God calls us, like Simon, to play our part, to not be bystanders, but participants, not watchers, but witnesses. The Bodhi. Some days are like this. You wake with an ache in your chest that isn't even yours. You know that somewhere great rivers of blood are being shed. Somewhere mothers are weeping over children, bodies strewn like wildflowers. Somewhere men and women eat a bowl of pain. A man tells his wife that he is leaving. A woman wakes in an empty bed or puts her hand to an empty place where a breast was. Somewhere in the screeching of brakes, there is a shattering of glass of lives. This earth is covered in a sea of suffering. If for a few moments we manage to forget, do not begrudge us our wine, our prayer, our reaching out for a word, a touch, even from a stranger. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Lord, we hold before you now the pain and brokenness of our world, of those we know who feel broken this day, those known only to you. And we ask that you give us the courage to move from being bystanders to witnesses, from observers to participants. Amen. And we sing hymn number 123, There is a Green Hill Far Away.
When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus, there the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
So we watch the detail. We watch for the meaning as the circle around Jesus grows smaller and the scene becomes ever more intense. Time starts to slow down. The words become quite spare. They crucified him. They crucified him. It's as stark as that, and it's as complex as that. All the verbs are harsh. The people around are splitting clothing, casting stones, sneering, mocking, deriding, hurling, challenging. Challenging is one of those words that sometimes in our 21st century world is a bit of a sort of euphemism. We put it into inverted commas. We say they have lifestyle challenges, challenging behaviour. But challenging behaviour is actually just about challenge. And in this instance, challenging behaviour in its negative way can be harsh and unremitting. It's designed to put down the other, to build up power by throwing insults, poking fun, bullying, punching, swearing, all that aggression. And all around Jesus on the cross, people are exerting the power they think that they have over the one who dared to suggest that he might serve and save the world. Jesus is now stripped, laid low. His real name is forgotten. His real purpose is mocked and ridiculed. He is naked, and they gamble for his clothes. Clothes are actually quite important. I would say that. But actually they are. Clothes help to give us identity. They protect us. They define us. But really importantly, they give us dignity and worth. And that's why we should notice this detail, that Jesus is naked. So much of our art avoids this. Wander around the National Gallery or any other, and you will see Jesus delicately draped in a loincloth, so that we do not have to face the reality, the truth, that in stripping a person completely, power is being exercised absolutely. In her classic book, Good Friday People, Sheila Cassidy describes this reality when she herself was tortured in Chile, and many others since have described the same thing, naming the humiliation, the degradation, the loss of personhood that comes with forced stripping. It is there in the truth of sexual exploitation, whenever and however it happens, in a studio, on a street, in a club. It's there in the dark corners of the world, and yes, the dark corners of the virtual world. And it's here on the cross. Challenging. But the first words that Jesus speaks as they raise him up on the cross shows that despite this, he is holding fast to the sense of who he is. Father, forgive. forgive. The heart of his purpose, the reality of God's love. And he actually speaks forgiveness to those who are doing their job, yes, but going somehow beyond their job to mock, belittle, challenge everything that he came to do and say. But it's unremitting, and as the torment continues, the laughter challenging goes on. His identity is slowly being taken from him. And one voice speaks up. One voice calls him by his name, not just using a title, the King of the Jews, which is being thrown around and treated lightly and irreverently. It's being used as a challenge to the Romans and an insult to the Jewish leaders. No, someone does something different. Someone calls him by his name. Jesus. The thief on the cross, the second thief on the cross, doesn't call him the King of the Jews. Instead, what he does is he gives Jesus back his purpose, his identity as the one who forgives, the one who actually proclaimed a kingdom where the first shall be last and the last first, where righteousness and justice would reach beyond all borders. What does it mean to be given identity? Sometimes it's simply a name that says this life mattered, this life had value. And in the years long ago, back in the early days of Call the Midwife, those sort of years, stillborn babies were not named. And one of my friends had a daughter in the late part of the 1960s. And it wasn't until the late part of the 1990s when she was able to give her the name Chloe, to publicly speak of her, to publicly acknowledge, to offer prayers and thanksgiving and find healing, because a name matters. Jesus, said the thief. Maybe it's having a story told, a story which changes someone from simply being a statistic into a life that counts or a death that matters. Whether you are Yasin, who died in Grenfell, whether you are Mohammed from Syria drowning on a boat, Bogdan fleeing from Kharkov, or Susan, or Derek, or Gloria, who died 3 years ago of a virus that shaped our lives, are in a wall by the Thames. A name matters, identity matters, and the thief on the cross recognised Jesus, knew the truth of who he is. And as he spoke his request, he kind of offered a very different kind of challenge, the kind of challenge we give when we have the courage to speak up, to be different from those who mock and jeer and bully. That's the small kindnesses that make a difference in our world, when we stand firm against the lure of the group and we refuse to join in with mass opinion and give each and every person their worth. And I just like to think that in that moment of agony, in that moment when the thief said, Jesus, Jesus himself heard the echo of his mother, who would have whispered his name throughout his childhood, shouted at him when he was naughty. His disciples, they said, oh, Jesus. And God, who said, this is my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. And in that moment, Jesus too remembered the great love of the Father that had brought him to this moment. In these tiny details, we are watching as the heart of God is revealed to the world. Jesus lives out his message of reconciliation. Jesus dies out his message of reconciliation, a welcome for all, and especially those whom the world despises, like the thief on the cross, remembered forever. In this silence, after I read the poem Kindness, hold before God the names that are on your heart and perhaps those whose names are known to God alone. Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things, feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop, the passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out of the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know the kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it until your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Lord, help me to remember you, and help me to remember all those this day who need a name, to know that they are named and that your love is there for them. Amen. And we sing our next hymn, hymn number 308, Just As I Am.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. While the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
Whichever road we were on, there were roadworks. There is no way to Easter except through the cross. And now we fix our eyes on Jesus, this intense moment on the man dying on a cross. The disciples who wanted to avoid death have hidden or run away. The people with questions are silenced. The watchers from the sidelines have faded into the background, and all the challengers become still. Death is approaching. For more than 9 hours, Paul's family sat vigil as Paul, unconscious, now drew increasingly infrequent breaths, his eyelids closed, his face unburdened, the room saturated with love. That is the rather beautiful description that marks the end of Paul Kalanithe's life, described in the book I mentioned earlier, When Breath Becomes Air. The room saturated with love. It all sounds very calm and peaceful, but many of us will know at first hand that a vigil with the dying is not always like that. It often seems to me no coincidence that we talk of labouring for breath as we approach the end of life, the work of dying, just as we laboured for life and for birth. And now Jesus is labouring for breath. Jesus is dying, not in 9 hours, but 3. And we, those who know him, his acquaintances, are watching and waiting with those who are at the foot of the cross. In a room, in a world saturated with love. But Jesus is alone, feels alone. He is isolated from all those that he loved, and he's isolated from God as well. And we hear his agonizing cry, my God, words which echo Psalm 22, and yet echo the cry of every heart that struggles with a weight of pain that suddenly feels too great to bear. You may have been there. You may know someone who is there in that darkness of loneliness and isolation. It may be that you have had or are having a time in your life when there is a situation that's so incomprehensible, so devastating, that there was no way that other people could reach you. You may have felt that sense of being forsaken, of wrapping your arms around your body and your head, burying deep into the bedclothes as darkness overwhelms. For some, there is the isolation of pain, the pain of body or the pain of mind, when confusion or distress takes thoughts in directions where no one else can really go, and every person seems to be turned against you. And then there are those in our world, even perhaps here in your village, who are isolated by difference of ability, education, history, language, culture. There are those who've been forced far from their homeland, and they're often crying out deep inside, my God, as they face the tiny pinpricks of animosity and that isolation that is brought about by indifference. So Jesus cried out on the cross, cried out in his loneliness, cried out from that place where only he could go, the place where he is isolated, not just from humanity, but from God himself, from his very self. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is Jesus' anguished cry in the darkness. Because Jesus is here knowing the reality of pain. Now, caring, if many of you may have done that in your life, caring for someone in pain is actually really tough. It's very tough. These days, there is the endless, what I might call, paraphernalia of pain relief. There are those invasive moments of the body, the need to see and do things you never wished to see or do. And then there are long nights, and pain breaks through, and the person whispers, like Jesus, I thirst. But Jesus' pain is not taking place in private. His death is taking place in public, in the midst of a crowded city with some interested onlookers and lots more disinterested passers-by. It's a public death. I thirst, whispers Jesus. Jesus, who is the one, who is the word of life, who breathed and dust became humankind, who actually knows the intricacies of every muscle, capillary, stem cell. Now Jesus is the one who is in the darkness of physical pain. I thirst. And all he is offered is soured wine. Perhaps it was an anaesthetic. Perhaps it was another form of mockery. Jesus' death is very real. He did not pretend, he did not avoid it. And because of injustice, apathy, anger, he was killed, like countless others in time and place. And Luke records that final cry, into your hands I commend my spirit. That sense that even at the end of his life, even as Jesus feels that perhaps everything has gone from him, the people who needed him, the people who loved him, the loneliness of pain is there, he trusts that in that moment, this death on the cross will have a meaning and purpose that has brought us, even us, 2,000 years later, here today. Because in that death, there is life for us. Jesus echoes in those words, I commend my spirit, Psalm 31. And Psalm 31 is really what we might call a psalm of refuge. It's a cry for rescue. It's the prayer of the outcast, maybe the prayer of the asylum seeker, the one who is estranged, the one who feels themselves far from home, far from love, and far from God. And it's interesting that it's in that final cry that actually someone recognises again who Jesus is, recognises the truth about him, a bit like the thief who gives him back his name in that moment. These words come not from Jesus' friends, not from Jesus' family, but from a soldier who is serving far from home. It's a Gentile, one of those whom Jesus has welcomed. We probably know the words which are recorded in a different gospel. We know it from films and all sorts of different ways. The person, the centurion, who stands at the foot of the cross and acknowledges the innocence and the truth about Jesus. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Silence falls. And the gospel writers use so much dramatic language to try and capture the enormity of what has happened. The world seems to fall apart, as it does so often when we encounter death. But this is a greater rift through the world because this is Jesus who has died, who has stretched out his arms on the cross and died for us and for a world in pain. Listen to the poem Love Wins, written in the context of World War I by Stuart Kennedy, and think in the silence how you respond to Jesus' death on the cross. Love wins. I look upon that body, writhing, pierced and torn with nails, and see the battlefields of time, the mangled dead, the gaping wounds, the sweating dazed survivors straggling back, the widows worn and haggard, still dry-eyed because their weight of sorrow will not lift and lets them weep. I see the ravished maid, the honest mother in her shame. I see all history pass by, and through it all still shines that face, the Christ face, like a star which pierces drifting clouds and tells the truth. So through the clouds of Calvary there shines his face, and I believe that evil dies and good lives on, loves on, and conquers all. All war must end in peace. These clouds are lies. They cannot last. The blue sky is the truth, for God is love. Such is my faith, and such my reasons for it, and I find them strong enough. And you? You want to argue? Well, I can't. It is a choice. I chose the Christ. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Lord, help us to choose Christ. Help us to be renewed in our confidence that love wins. Help us to stay faithful as we watch and wait at the foot of the cross. Amen. And now we sing the hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, number 127.
Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan of action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment.
We have watched and waited. Jesus has died. It is over. You may wonder what more there could be, because the sword will not pierce any deeper. So what is the final stage as we journey through these 3 hours? It's a strange thing because, of course, we always know the reality of Easter Day. But when we are living a story of death, we don't know what is coming next. And now is the time for grief. Now is the time for sadness and sorrow as the body is taken down from the cross. There is no purpose now. The task of a human body of walking and moving and being and talking is finished. The task of Jesus dying on the cross is finished. But in these moments now, these moments in the aftermath of death are deeply poignant. Classically, this moment before the burial, when the body is taken down from the cross, is known as the deposition. And often, in contrast to paintings of the crucifixion, interpretations of this moment are actually deeply moving. Sometimes the painting and art of the crucifixion looks quite sort of stark and almost clinical and cold. But as the body of Jesus is lowered at the cross, it is lowered into the hands of the women gathered there. And it's almost like a parody of midwives who stretch up to pull a child down into life. And yet the great artists Rembrandt, Caravaggio and others show this as a moment of great desolation, a desolation beyond words, as that human form designed for life and strength and joy and love is given back limply to those women who loved him. And they cradle him, they lovingly caress him, they let their tears anoint him, they bring their gifts to him. This is the reality of grief, and it's something we can kind of ignore in that watching and the waiting at the cross, because, as I said, we know the end of Jesus' story. We know it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. And all too quickly in our churches, we move from this moment to putting in our flowers and our daffodils and our sunshine and our hallelujahs. But as we watch these women, these loyal friends of Jesus, what we are watching is the work of grief, the journey that all of us begin when someone we care about is no longer breathing among us. There is shock, there is anger, there is denial, there is sadness. And sometimes these are described as the stages of grief, as if there were some kind of orderly procession, as if each day would unfold like a kind of couch to 5K programme with steps and goals and targets for grief. In reality, as many of you, all of you will know, all these things happen all the time in the journey of grief. Grief is like a great big tangled ball of strings with endless ends to pull and knots to wrestle with, things that unravel and things that remain a mess. This is the journey of grief. Today, so much is written about loss.
And in a good way, if we began these 3 hours recognizing that sometimes we want to avoid the reality of our own mortality, there is a sense in which we are getting better, perhaps, at recognizing the reality of grief, the weight of it, the time it takes, the questions that it raises. Maybe that pandemic made us push a bit harder to break through that taboo and recognise the long and painful journey that many are on of grief. Because so many lives are touched in death, sometimes more than was ever possible in life. We can think of people whose death has been very public. Even this week we've heard of the impact of the death of Deborah James, known as Bowel Babe, and the huge amounts of money raised, the repercussions that come, more lives than were ever possible in her death. And Jesus' death is reaching out and touching so many, even that day across Jerusalem, that night as night fell, as dusk came, news will be travelling, people will be beginning to grieve, remembering, reflecting, asking big questions, for grief does indeed make us ask big questions as we grapple with those big feelings, as we watch for details and we watch for meaning, as we search for comfort, search for love and find hope. And in Jesus, in every part of his death, all our grief and pain is held, even as the women hold his body now. What more can they do? What less could they do? Because actually, the tender care of a dead body is the last service we can offer. It's the last act of unconditional love. Was it actually why the work of funeral directors is so important, and why the hospice movement is so special, not only in preparing people for death, but in tenderly dealing with death itself. Time spent with a body, the outward form of a person we loved, is time to be treasured. It's so important. And the women who loved the man Jesus offer him their tenderness one last time. And he is carried to a tomb. Yes, we're told, it is a stranger's tomb, but it was a place to lie a body. And actually, across our world, there are many, many victims of war and violence who have no grave, strangers or other, but lie thrown in a pit with 100 others. And even as we weep for Jesus, men, women, children weep for those they love, whose grave is unknown. Across the years, just of the last bit of our 20th century, 21st century, we know of Bosnia, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, and right now we know that is in Ukraine for so many. We know it happens too, even on a lonely moorland. And places of memory matter on the journey of grief. And so Jesus is placed in a tomb, in a borrowed tomb. And they place him with care and love on his bed of stone. And then they roll the stone in place. And now it really is finished for us on this Good Friday. We have watched and waited at the cross. We have seen the details. We've noticed the words. We have thought about the bystanders, the participants. We've engaged with Jesus and felt the weight of loss. And now we are left with all his followers struggling to find meaning. With all who walk with Jesus have felt the pain as we leave the one we love in the stillness of the grave. I'll end before our last silence with a poem I happen to read every Good Friday called Pieta, which just takes us with a glimpse of Easter. Your work accomplished, now I know the sharpness of the sword that pierces my heart through. Again I hold you in my arms, caress and kiss that dearest form which carried all my love. But as I watched you grow, I knew the life in you I nurtured had a purpose I found hard to bear, for you were mine and yet not mine. For though you loved me as my dearest son, I knew your being drew its inner life from the mysterious one you called your Father. And as you taught and healed and blessed, his love in you embraced all humankind. I touch your wounded feet which walked the way that led you to the cross. I kiss your silent lips which spoke the truth the powerful still reject. I feel the stillness of your lifeless heart and know the light of life itself has died. The piercing grief and weight of total loss are now commensurate with the joy I knew in this my dearest love. Now others wrap you round and lay you in your waiting tomb. And waiting night and day and night, until I feel the stirring in that earthy womb, and pain and grief and loss and death, which laboured in you for your victory, give birth to life and truth, your living way, and break out in the glory of your Easter day.
God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. Lord God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for your great love and for Jesus. We give you thanks for your love for the world. We simply ask that you would help us to hold that love in our hearts and share it generously with others. Amen. We're going to sing our final hymn, which is quite long, but we will sing all 7 verses. And the hymn is "My Song is Love Unknown." At the end of that, I'll say one final prayer and then ask that you leave quietly or in silence. So "My Song is Love Unknown," hymn number 112. Eternal God, in the cross of Jesus, we see the cost of our sin and the depth of your love. In humble hope and fear, may we place at his feet all that we have and all that we are. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.